Okay, so this is a fantastic honor to have Joe LeDoux in the Philosophy in Biology and Medicine seminar today. Um, as many of you know, the goal of philosophy in biology and medicine is to combine philosophy and biology and to raise important conceptual and theoretical questions within the biological sciences. And I think Joe offers a fantastic example of that. Um, Joe LeDoux is the Henry Lucimossis Professor of Science at NYU in the Center for Neuroscience. He's the director of the Emotional Brain Institute at NYU. He's also a professor of psychiatry and child and adolescent psychiatry at NYU Langone Medical School. I know, though, that he's progressively closing his lab and retiring from some of these functions, so perhaps he will tell us more about that today. As you all know, the work of Professor LeDoux is focused on the brain mechanisms of memory and emotion. His research is primarily focused on survival circuits, including their impacts on emotions such as fear and anxiety. A little bit more specifically, his work has shed light on how the brain detects and responds to threats and how memories about such experiences are formed and stored through cellular, synaptic, and molecular changes in the amygdala. The amygdala is very important in his work, as you all know. LeDoux has received several awards, including the William James Award from the Association for Psychological Science, the Carl Spencer Lashley Award from the American Philosophical Society, and the Thyssen International Prize in Cognitive Science. And here, this is really among many other awards and prizes. I just picked up 3 of them. LeDoux is also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science, the New York Academy of Sciences, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and a member of the National Academy of Sciences. Joe is also the lead singer and songwriter in the rock band The Amygdalites. And for your information, The Amygdalites recorded their debut CD in June 2007. And I really like the title, which is Heavy Mental. Joe is the author of several books, The Emotional Brain, The Synaptic Self, Anxious, The Deep History of Ourselves, which is this one. This is the one published in 2019, if I remember correctly. And I think what is very impressive is that these books succeed in being both easily readable by a lay audience, and at the same time, they are very deep and informative, even for specialists. But I think it's very rare, and this is something that Joe does in a very unparalleled way. His very recent book, The Four Realms of Existence, A New Theory of Being Human, was published by Harvard University Press a few months ago in October. And there, LeDoux offers a new framework on who we are, theorizing 4 realms of existence: bodily, neural, cognitive, and conscious. And there he explores the issue of our individuality and identity, a topic which, of course, has interested me quite a lot and has interested many of you as well here in this virtual room. Before handing over to Joe, I would like to thank Ken Schaffner, our common friend, who, as you know, is a fantastic philosopher of science who is constantly interacting with the most brilliant scientists. And Ken, in fact, is the one who put me in contact with Joe in the first place. And I think this was a great thing, again, that Ken did. And last year, I met Joe at Cambridge, well, a few months ago, in fact, and that was very, very interesting for me. Today, Joe will talk about our 4 realms of existence, a fresh look at the science of what and who we are. Thank you so much, Joe, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So yes, I have closed my lab. I no longer do research, and I'm very happy about that because it's very stressful having to raise money and take care of a lot of people's lives and so forth. And now I just have to worry about my own life and do what I would want to do. My very beginning in research, I had 2 degrees in business starting in the late 60s, early 70s. Got an undergraduate in business administration, then a master's in marketing. And while I was doing that, I fell in love with the brain by taking a course by a guy who was studying the brain. I didn't know that you could study the brain. And so it was just back then, there wasn't much known about the brain in terms of like things we know today, and the Society for Neuroscience had just begun to be established. So it wasn't a very formal field. And, they were looking for bodies. And so I walked in and said I wanted to be a neuroscientist, and they took me in anyway without having any background. And my PhD was easy because, I studied split brain patients for my PhD. You don't need to know a lot about the brain, kind of left, right, front, back, and show some pictures to one hemisphere or the other. But one of the things that resulted from my dissertation was an idea that my mentor and I, Mike Zaniga, had about how a lot of our behaviors are produced unconsciously. And what we do to account for that and to prevent seeing ourselves behaving in ways we didn't consciously control is we generate a story or a narrative or an interpretation that makes our behavior make sense. And so I thought that emotional behaviors might be the kinds of behaviors that would demand those kinds of dissonance reducing explanations. And I decided to study emotion. But the techniques at the time were not very good for studying the human brain. So I turned to rats because I assumed that the brain circuits that control emotional behaviors unconsciously would be the same in rats and humans. And that's what I've done most of my career, is doing empirical research on that particular problem, especially in the context of threat and fear and so forth. Well, now that I've closed my lab, I have more time to think about bigger questions. And the fact is, throughout my career and all of my books, they were all based on my empirical research, but there was always an element about conscious experience in it because I felt very attached to that from my PhD work. And so I like I said, I've just continued to be interested in consciousness and how it relates to everything else that's going on in the brain. So let's jump in. I'm going to share my screen here. And this, okay, hopefully this will do the trick. Okay. As Thomas already explained, I have a new book, The Four Realms of Existence. And let me just move this window over here out of my way. Okay. And so let me just get in here. So many of us understand that the mental aspect of who we are is embedded in the part of the body known as the brain, and therefore is also part of our physical bodily existence. Still, even true believers of the physical nature of the mind sometimes feel as though it possesses some quality or qualities lacking in other physical systems within our body and even within our brain. So we have firsthand knowledge of the mental states we refer to as perceptions, memories, thoughts, and so forth, and emotions, but we lack awareness of the processes that control digestion, respiration, heart rhythm, and much of our behavior. So what is it about the mental stuff that makes it seem so different from the physical stuff that constitutes who and what we are? So just as your mind depends on your brain being part of your body depends on the life-sustaining functions of other components of your body. If your heart stops beating or your lungs collapse, all other organs, including your brain, will soon cease to function in a way that's compatible with life. Without bodily life, there's no brain function. Without brain function, there's no mind. So then how, out of all of this physicality, biological physicality, do we each come to exist as a being that knows it was born in the past, knows that it exists now, and knows that it will someday die? The standard approach to such questions about individuality is to focus on psychological notions like self or personality. These have long guided philosophical musings as well as scientific theories and research about what it means to be a human. But there's little agreement about what self and personality refer to, and even whether they refer to real entities as opposed to just being shorthand labels for a variety of psychologically interesting phenomena. So David Hume said, he called the self the elusive I. Sean Gallagher, despite the comfort level of the field, talking about the self, what is said is usually controversial. Daniel Dennett, the self is an illusion. Harry Stack Sullivan, personality is an illusion. Walter Mischel, personality is a myth. Owen Flanagan, just because self is in our vocabulary does not mean that it has any explanatory role. Thomas Metzinger, nobody ever had or was a self. And my version, yourself is not a thing. It's a story about who you are. So scientific discoveries over the last several decades in diverse fields such as neuroscience, immunology, genetics, and artificial intelligence have led to new ideas about human beings, how we exist as physical systems. These findings and challenging cherished assumptions about human nature have resulted in an epistemological vacuum. In no small part, this is because thinking about what and who we are is not advanced scientifically beyond traditional ideas some put forth centuries ago. The various phenomena that have been discovered while studying self and personality have, without question, provided important insights into human nature. But what if it is our scientific understanding of what and who we are that is confused? Specifically, what if our constructs are inadequate as conceptual hooks on which to hang the empirical findings that have been discovered in the name of self and personality? Because these centuries-old notions obscure as much as they reveal, the phenomena might be better served by a new conceptual home, one grounded in contemporary scientific conceptions and empirical research. So a human being can be characterized as a composite of four fundamental, parallel, entwined realms of existence that reflect our evolutionary past and account for our present ways of being: biological, neurobiological, cognitive, and conscious. All four deep down are, of course, biological, but the neurobiological transcends the mere biological, the cognitive transcends the mere neurobiological, and the conscious transcends the mere cognitive. They coalesce as an ensemble of being. Together, the four realms and the resulting ensemble account for what and who we are, including those aspects of us that fall under the rubrics of self and personality. So the Four Realms idea is not about reduction of higher to lower levels, as in the unity of science movement. It's instead about how symbiotic interactions between the levels sustain the organism. Biological existence allows neurobiological existence to occur, and neurobiological allows cognitive, and cognitive allows conscious. So each realm anatomically permeates and physiologically enables the level above it, and at the same time, the survival potential of the level below is enhanced by the one above. The realms somewhat resemble the components of a Russian doll. But unlike a Russian doll, in which the parts simply stack on top of one another, our component realms are conjoined, integrated, and interdependent. Everything about an individual human being, biologically and psychologically, is subsumed within the entwined, nested hierarchical organization of our realm of existence. A case could be made that society and culture are additional realms, but I believe these are things we do with our cognitive and conscious realms. So it's relatively easy to separate biological beings from non-living matter. If something is alive, it's a biological being. Deciding which biological beings exist neurobiologically is also relatively straightforward. If an organism has a nervous system, it's a neurobiological being, and by definition, it exists neurobiologically. That narrows down things down to animals, or at least most animals, since only animals have nervous systems. When it comes to the cognitive and conscious realms, things get more complex, since there are no equivalent physical properties that unequivocally identify which organisms are cognitive and conscious beings. We have to rely on behavioral criteria. It can be tricky, since different scientists define cognition and consciousness differently. My goal is less about identifying which animals are cognitive and are conscious, though. It is instead about how our four realms interact and make humans what and who we are. So we see on the bottom here, on the left side, all organisms are biological realm, have a biological realm involving metabolism, replication, and so forth. All animals have a neurobiological realm, and no other kind of organism has a neurobiological realm besides animals. Some animals, mammals and birds in particular, and perhaps others, have a cognitive realm, and some of those also have a subjective experience realm or a conscious realm, and certainly humans and perhaps other animals as well. Again, I don't want to get hung up on which other animals are involved here, My interest is primarily in what makes us human beings. So you can see the codependence and entwinement of these realms. Each is related to the one above it, but also to the one below it. So let's just briefly talk about the biological realm. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. It's, of course, required for life-sustaining bodily functions. Here's a drawing from Paul Psychiatry, where you have life dependent, you have individual survival dependent on metabolism, and species survival dependent upon replication or reproduction. The entwined realms of existence in the context of evolution can be seen in this way. Here's Leo Bus. New organisms not only possess novel features, but also retain features of the group they diverged from. New or newly changed features often become the primary target of natural selection going forward. Basic life-sustaining physiological functions have repeatedly been tested for their survival value and tend to change relatively little in the evolution of new species. More often, the changes involve new processes that control the way the organism's particular kind of body interacts with its environment in supporting metabolism and sustaining life. John Maynard Smith sought a mechanistic, specifically a genetic explanation of how the transition from lower to higher levels took place over the course of evolution. And Richard Michaud illustrated some of the major transitions by talking about protocells with metabolism and replication. These were the foundation for true cells with free-floating DNA, and especially in prokaryotes. Cells with sequestered DNA that sexually reproduce, that would be eukaryotes, and then multicellular eukaryotes, plants, fungi, and animals. So here we can see the nested hierarchy of these components. So at the bottom, you have a single cell without any sequestration of the DNA. Then with eukaryotes, you have a sequestration of the DNA and some other small particles within the cell. With multicellular organisms, you have lots of cells with the sequestered DNA and other components like metabolism and so forth. And with complex multicellular organisms, you also have tissues that are made up of the smaller components. The neurobiological realm. This is about physiological and behavioral control by a nervous system. So Alfred Sherman Romer was a prominent comparative anatomist in the mid-20th century. And he had an interesting quote that I came across when I first got involved in neuroscience back in the late 1960s, early 1970s. He said, in many regards, the vertebrate organism, whether fish or mammal, is a well-knit unit structure. But in other respects, there seems to be a somewhat imperfect welding, functionally and structurally, of two somewhat distinct beings. An external somatic animal, including most of the flesh and bone of our body, and an internal visceral animal, basically consisting of the digestive tract and its appendages, which to a considerable degree conducts its own affairs and over which the somatic animal exerts but incomplete control. So here we have the typical view of the nervous system with the central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system, and we can easily put Romer's somatic and visceral components in the central nervous system and also in the peripheral nervous system. But that's not what Romer had in mind. He had a different perspective. The traditional view with the focus on the CNS and the peripheral nervous system is replaced in his scheme with a main focus on somatic and visceral components as the fundamental components of the nervous system, with the central or peripheral location being secondary to the somatic and visceral organization. So here we can see that this visceral somatic distinction can be carried back all the way to the earliest forms of life. You have the visceral functions within a protozoa or a bacterium that involve some kind of metabolism sustaining bodily life, and a somatic component that allows interaction with the external environment. It's basically the internal and external milieu. With animals, in addition to having a visceral and somatic body, you also have a visceral and somatic nervous system. Early animals, this was only a peripheral nervous system, since there was no central nervous system. But by the time bilateral animals came along about 650 million years ago, a central nervous system was added. But you can see the continuity starting with without any nervous system, but simply a body that has a somatic and a visceral component. That paved the way when animals arrived to have a different kind of regulation involving a nervous system, which just continued. The nervous system evolved as a continuation of this visceral and somatic functions, these visceral and somatic functions that are initially only biological, and on into the central nervous system. So through natural selection, the visceral and somatic functions of the body of unicellular protozoan ancestors were carried forward into early animals and their peripheral nervous systems and into a CNS as animals diversified. So what is the defining feature of a neurobiological realm response? Well, it's stimulus-elicited automatic neural activities. Basically, sensory motor integration involved in reflexes, motor programs, instincts or fixed action patterns, as the ethologists call them, Pavlovian conditioned responses, and stimulus response habits. These are all responses that can be controlled without any cognition or consciousness. It's simply responses to a stimulus in the outside world that are automatically triggered. So this is the circuit that I worked on for many, many decades, involving threat processing of a threat that goes into a sensory system. It reaches the amygdala. The amygdala then initiates a visceral chain and a somatic chain, which fits perfect. This was not something I was focused on when I was doing the research so much. It just happens to fit perfectly into Romer's partition. Through the visceral system, you can produce physiological responses like heart rate, sweating, release of hormones, and so forth. And through the somatic part of this, you have control of the skeletal muscles, such as freezing and fleeing and so forth. So these circuits do not make conscious fear. They detect and respond to innate and learned threats with pre-programmed motor reactions. Fear is the conscious awareness of being in harm's way. And so even though I've worked on the amygdala for a long time and was part of the group that almost everyone involved in this work called the amygdala a fear center or fear circuit or so forth, but I came to view this as not a fear circuit, but instead a threat detection circuit. And that I think it conflates things, messes up how we think about things. If we talk about non-mental state activities, like detecting danger and responding to danger, which goes back to the beginning of life, if we conflate those with the subjective experience of danger, which is a completely separate thing and only present in some animals. So another circuit that's very important in all of this is the basal ganglia. So this is involved in stimulus response learning, habit learning. So you have sensory cortex and motor cortex, sensory cortex, motor cortex, dorsal basal ganglia and striatum. Dopamine is released into the striatum, basal ganglia here, and that solidifies sensory motor connections so that the stimulus can then produce a habitual response. So let's now turn to the cognitive realm. For me, the cognitive realm is all about mental models that make predictions based on internal representations. So the capacity to construct mental models of the world and to use these in thinking, planning, deciding, acting, and feeling. That's how I define cognition. Now, there's a long history of mental models in modern times and how they work. And I think the first one, and probably the most famous, was by Kenneth Craik in 1943. He said that if the organism carries a small-scale model of external reality and of its own possible actions within its head, it's able to try out various alternatives, conclude which is the best of them, react to future situations before they arise, utilize knowledge of past events in dealing with the present and future, and in every way to react in a much fuller, safer, and more competent manner to the emergencies which face it. So there have been other versions of this, but I want to jump to the one that Nathaniel Daw and colleagues has popularized, which is the model-free versus model-based distinction. Model-free, meaning no mental model, you just have stimulus-response activities, maps onto the neurobiological realm processes, whereas model-based maps onto the cognitive realm processes. So here we see the habit circuit of reptiles, and as mammals, well, Eric Kandel and others have pointed out that the evolution of novel behavioral circuits often involves changes, and sometimes small changes, in existing circuits, just as Bus was talking about. The old is carried forward to allow the new to exist. So the habit system of reptiles is carried forward in mammals in a way that allowed much more complex kinds of behaviors, especially goal-directed activities. And for this to happen in parallel, it didn't just happen all of a sudden, but the parallel adjustment of behavior and neural circuits resulted in much more complex components of the basal ganglia. The dorsal basal ganglia split was the basis for the evolution of these two other areas, the dorsomedial and the ventral basal ganglia. And these then interacted with different kinds of cortex that have evolved out of sensory motor cortex, especially areas of the prefrontal cortex that construct mental models and process values about body states and so forth. So with mammals, we get a much more complicated kind of system, but it's all based on a more primitive system. What about the conscious realm? Well, there's a lot we could say about that, but I'll just start with the age-old question: is consciousness a scientific mystery? Yes, in the sense that the mechanisms underlying biological inheritance or bacterial infections were mysterious before they were figured out. If something's not physical, then it's not a scientific problem. If it's physical, it's a scientific problem that can be potentially solved. Scientific pursuit of what it feels like to be conscious, in other words, qualia, should not be limited by philosophical concerns about such feelings being too hard for science. If you make subjective experiences like qualia non-physical, you're making them non-scientific and setting up the scientific problem in a way that can only lead to failure. William James said, "Our reasonings have not established the non-existence of the soul. They've only proved its superfluity for scientific purposes." I think the same can be said about ideas like dualistic ideas about qualia. That's fine as a philosophical idea, but it's a non-starter scientifically. Panpsychism, the same way. So some scientific notions of consciousness, one that is talked about sometimes is creature consciousness, the condition of being alive and awake and behaviorally responsive to the environment. That exists in all animals. They're all capable of responding to the environment, or maybe there's some I don't know about, but let's say most animals then. And the mental state consciousness, the capacity to experience the world and one's relationship to it. And that, I think, only exists in some animals. Again, I'm not going to go down the road of which animals are conscious and which aren't. It's just not what this is about. It's mostly about being human. And then, of course, there's sentience. But I think it's used so differently and so widely that I'm not even going to talk about it. I can fit it into my scheme, and I have in some things that I've written about. But for the present purposes, we're going to talk mainly about creature conscious and mental state consciousness. So there's a lot of research on consciousness and the brain. And this work has focused primarily on two brain areas and mostly on the visual system. So the two brain areas often talked about are the visual cortex and the lateral prefrontal cortex. So first-order theories propose that lower-order representations in the visual cortex are sufficient for the conscious experience, whereas other higher-order and global workspace theories propose that first-order states are not sufficient, that you need some additional processing, cognitive processing, that PFC adds to the mix. So I think that we could use a, let me just get a sip of water here. I think the study of the brain and consciousness could use a neuroanatomical upgrade. This idea of these two areas is just way too simple. As in real life, as opposed to psychophysics labs, a conscious experience is typically multimodal, involves a variety of lower order inputs. So if that's correct, then every sensory system, every system in the brain has to have its own mechanism of consciousness if the first order idea is correct. Whereas with the others, you have a more integrated system that can process a lot of different kinds of information. So, but also the prefrontal cortex circuitry is far more complex, and its inputs are much more diverse than typically acknowledged in the debate, even in those who are proponents of the prefrontal cortex having something to do with it. So, for example, if we look at, instead of asking about, what information flow goes from sensory cortex to lateral prefrontal cortex, let's instead ask the opposite question. What are the inputs to the lateral prefrontal cortex? What are all of the inputs to lateral prefrontal cortex? Well, there are a lot of sensory inputs. You've got visual cortex, auditory cortex, somatosensory cortex, and on. But there are also memory and conceptual circuits, multimodal circuits that provide inputs to dorsolateral and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. Medial temporal lobe, where the memory systems are typically located. Lateral temporal lobe, where you have some somatic memory that's separate from episodic memory. So superior temporal sulcus, higher order areas, parieto occipital junction, again, multimodal integration, and prefrontal circuits. So not only does dorsolateral and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex get these lower order inputs, it also gets inputs that come from other prefrontal areas. For example, we divide these prefrontal areas into subgranular and granular. So here's the subgranular, orbital frontal prefrontal cortex, ventromedial prefrontal, anterior cingulate. So those are all subgranular or agranular. That means they don't have the granular layer that makes lateral prefrontal cortex so special and enables so much of cognition. I don't think we fully understand what the granular prefrontal cortex does, but it's a mark of these higher cognitive areas in a sense. So the granular prefrontal areas include the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex and the frontal pole. So here we can see it on the left side. You have the lateral prefrontal cortex in dark gray. There's also some granular prefrontal cortex in the dark gray that folds over onto the medial side of the prefrontal cortex. But most of the medial prefrontal cortex areas are dysgranular, agranular, subgranular, whatever you want to call it. Now, what's interesting about these areas, if we look over here on the right side, in the medial prefrontal cortex, there are these gray areas. These are the agranular, subgranular areas, and they are shared by all mammals. Then you have some areas also in a darker gray in the dorsomedial and the medial prefrontal cortex. Those are the ones that fold over from the lateral. These are granular prefrontal areas that fold over from the lateral. And then in the lateral, you in addition have a black area. So what happened? The black area, little black dot in the gray area, that is only present in the human brain. The other gray areas in the dorsolateral and ventrolateral and the dorsomedial and medial prefrontal areas are shared by all primates, and the gray areas are are shared by all mammals. So we have three kinds of cortex that are interesting in the sense that suppose we knew more about how human consciousness occurs in the brain. And let's say, just for the sake of argument, this is a simplification, but I'm just using it to illustrate a point. let's say that the black area present only in humans in the so-called lateral frontal pole has some critical role in self-awareness, in human self-awareness. That would explain why it's so hard to demonstrate self-awareness in primates, non-human primates, and in other mammals, because they don't have that area. Again, I'm not saying that that is the only, it's not like this is a homunculus or anything, but let's say this is an area, a component that is very important to the awareness of oneself. Now you've got default mode network and all other kinds of things that are going to be involved in that as well. But to have the experience of it, you may need that black area, just a hypothesis. And on the other hand, the parts of the prefrontal cortex that are shared by all primates are the areas that are crucial to cognition, both in humans and non-human primates. So we could have this perhaps as a way of having a kind of semantic or conceptual consciousness as well. So maybe self-consciousness involves the more human-like part of the prefrontal cortex, whereas conceptual and semantic awareness of things in the world, what they are and their relationship to all other things, might require the dorsolateral and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex to integrate the information in a way that it can be experienced. Whereas the more primitive kinds of states that we might have and shared by all mammals could involve these more medial areas that process body state information, reward information. A lot of default mode network and other networks come into there and so forth. So that could be a kind of non-conceptual, what Indo Talving called anoetic consciousness, that is just there. You don't have to say, I know that this is my body. I know that when I walk into my apartment, this is my home. I just know it. It's just there as a kind of implicit fact that is known to me. And because I've lived my whole life with my body, and I've lived a long time in my apartment, so I know what it feels like and don't have to acknowledge my feelings about it, unless when I walk in, something is amiss in the apartment. Or if I notice, like, let's say I went to the doctor and he said, well, there's something going on in your heart. So now every time you feel something in your chest, an itch or something, you think about your heart. And so these these itches and states are there all the time, but then they move around in the complexity of the brain and how it's represented when other things contextualize them. All right, that's kind of a long-winded rant. I didn't mean to go off on that in here, but maybe it helps. So another kind of upgrade we could use to the way of thinking about human consciousness is a physiological upgrade. Now, there are a lot of the lower order theories have a kind of idea of recurrency as being important in first order kinds of consciousness. But recurrency occurs throughout the brain. It's not something that only occurs in a first order kind of way. So here we have, again, this is highly simplified, but I've got some areas in the posterior areas of the cortex, unimodal sensory areas, auditory, vision, somatosensory, and so forth, and olfaction. All of that like converges into the higher order areas, still in the back of the brain, like the superior temporal sulcus and the medial temporal lobe and all of those. Well, the medial temporal lobe would be memory cortex, and that's converging into the temporal and parietal convergence zones. And then the convergence zones and each of the unimodal sensory areas, the memory areas, the convergence zones are all also independently projecting to prefrontal cortex. So there's a lot of information recurrency within each of those areas, within the areas in the back of the brain, and between the areas in the back of the brain and the areas in the front of the brain. There's a lot of interaction all the time. So In the prefrontal cortex, we have the same thing: lateral prefrontal cortex, prefrontal pole, mesocortical. This is all the medial prefrontal areas. All of those are getting inputs from all of the posterior areas. And so it's a very complicated thing, and they're all recurrent. They're refreshing all the time. The information that's coming in from the bottom is refreshing what was already present and updating it. So it's just constant updating that's possible within all these areas because of these connectivities and the physiological implications of those connectivities. So I've been talking about a multi-state hierarchical framework that we can use, I think, to better understand consciousness. So this perspective places the traditional volley between sensory cortex and lateral prefrontal cortex with this more complex anatomical arrangement consisting of a hierarchy of structures, each of which carries different kinds of states that are re-represented and redescribed by circuits of prefrontal cortex, and they contribute to mental modeling and conscious experience. So I've often talked about this in relation to higher order theory, but it's relevant to any and all theories of mental state consciousness in the brain. But mine is really more of a higher order anatomical framework than a higher order philosophical framework. So while I'm a big fan of David Rosenthal's higher order theory, I'm not committed to every component of it. I'm committed to those that I can make some sense anatomically out of. So again, I'm showing you the same stuff over and over again, but hopefully it will sink in as a result. So we've got sensory inputs going to sensory cortex. That's so-called sensations. Those sensations also make it to granular prefrontal cortex. But sensations by themselves are meaningless. They're only meaningful once they're integrated with memory. So perception involves the constant interflow between sensory cortex and memory cortex to create meaningful understanding of the world. But memory cortex also provides concepts to granular prefrontal cortex. And another important thing is schema. These begin in the hippocampus, in memory cortex of the hippocampus, and are amplified in subgranular prefrontal cortexes, and especially in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, where an active schema of the moment arises. Now, in order for that active schema of the moment to arise bottom up, all of these circuits have to be interacting with one another, starting with the sensory information in the outside world to contextualize what it is that all this is about. So that all goes up, bottom up to all of these places, but then there's top down back to everything as well. The schema, the basis of the mental model, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Jorge Morales, a philosophical friend of some of you, I assume, has said this about the model. The representations processed by prefrontal cortex are diverse and redundant. They have different degrees of abstraction that reflect their origin in multiple kinds of systems, sensory, memory, conceptual. As a result, the focus of awareness can change as an episode develops over time. The system is dynamic and distributed. It has many backdoors and backups. This may be why lesions of PFC have complex effects on consciousness. So here's a kind of structural view of what I've been talking about in relation to emotion. In the outside world, there's some physical or social threat that is channeled into the sensory system. Let's say we're now in sensory cortex. And sensory cortex will activate the amygdala, for example, and the threat is therefore detected. As a result, behavioral and physiological responses are produced in the body. Those responses can feed back into the brain and begin to become components of the schema. But the threat circuitry also can interact within the schema. The schema, as I mentioned earlier, start in memory cortex, but then are developed, elaborated in ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And the schema in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex the yellow, then becomes the basis of the mental model in blue. Now, how do you take all of that complex, multimodal, all kinds of circuit information coming into the mental model and turn that into some kind of experience? Well, you might need a kind of special output to do that. Why? Because the mental model not only generates your emotional experience, it also is the basis of self-report and goal-directed behavior. So you see the narration line is going to emotional experience, but there's a fork in it that goes to goal-directed behavior and self-report. So, but self-report and goal-directed behavior can also result once you're conscious. At least, that's what I would say. Maybe not everyone agrees with that. But if this is the case, then we can begin to see some complexities in the system that aren't necessarily always recognized. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit now. So going back now to my early work on split brain patients, what we're looking at here is a split brain patient who is presented with two images, one on the left and one on the right. The image on the right is a chicken claw. Image on the left is a snow scene. So the left hand connected to the right hemisphere points to the shovel because the right hemisphere saw a snow scene. And the right hand connected to the left hemisphere points to the chicken because the left hemisphere saw a chicken claw. Now, when you're talking to a split brain patient, you only talk to its left hemisphere. So you say, why did you do that? And the left hemisphere says, well, I saw a chicken claw, so I picked the chicken, and you need a shovel to clean up the chicken shed. This is the canonical narration, explanation, interpretation that the conscious left hemisphere is generating in response to a behavior that it did not produce. Only the right hemisphere saw the snow scene. The left hemisphere put the shovel with the chicken because he's a country boy and he knows that you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. So the Gazzaniga-LeDoux hypothesis was we humans think we control our behavior. Observing behaviors that are controlled non-consciously is discomforting. It produces cognitive dissonance. Given the multiplicity of non-conscious behavioral control systems in the brain, dissonance-reducing narratives may maintain a sense of mental unity in the face of this diverse complexity of mental, disintegration in a sense. So let's unpack these narration things a bit. So here we have a bunch of lower order states: sensory, perceptual, memory, conceptual, incentive, homeostatic, that are coming into the brain. The immediate, I don't know what that purple thing in there, but it's not supposed to be. The immediate order states are non-conscious. That's where the schema arises. And I'm skipping all the steps that lead to schema because I've hit you over the head with that already. Well, so the schema then is the basis for the non-conscious mental model. And the non-conscious mental model is the basis of the narrative that generates outputs to, okay. Let's just pause a second on this narrative. There's some talk these days about the sort of return of language of thought, mentalese, and so forth. And this is something, something I've been thinking about a long time. But the new ideas are that this narrative is amodal. So what does that mean? Well, you've got all these different systems back here that are providing different kinds of inputs. They're all being squished together into a unified representation as the schema, which then, populates the mental model that you become conscious of. Now, okay, let me take the next step. So the narrative leads to behavior, speech, and conscious experience. So how do you turn a multimodal integrated thing that is no longer multimodal, it's just a unit, into something that is now going to be unimodal on the output side. You need an amodal mental narrative, an amodal mentalese that can take the input and allow it to be translated in a way that speech can understand it, behavior can be controlled, and that you can talk about. That you can have the experience of. So you have to populate both the subjective experience and the speech and overt behavior. And then another narrative, conscious narrative, generates all of these other things. So this dual mental model, one conscious and the other not conscious, might account for, well, nobody needs to know that. It's an isolated thing. Let's look at the implications. So the modality-free, abstract, amodal nature of the narrative allows its conceptual content to be used by diverse downstream processes. For example, it allows one to respond verbally through speech, writing, or sign language, or non-verbally through a wide variety of distinct goal-directed actions. Each output of the mental model carries the mentalese narrative to its target. As a result, each processes the signal in its own way, because the processing of a motor signal for behavior is different from the processing of a speech signal for talking, and is also different from the processing of whatever a subjective experience is. So because each of these is a different pathway, some noise is introduced or some diversity is introduced in the way the narrative is taken out and then used by the output. This may explain why verbal reports, though fairly reliable as a measure of momentary conscious experience, don't always perfectly reflect what we experience. We can't always put into words everything we're conscious of, and why we're conscious of it. When stimuli are disgraded or otherwise difficult to process, such as when they occur in peripheral vision, incomplete reports can result. So I kind of chopped that up. Let me say that again. This may explain why verbal reports, though fairly reliable as measures of momentary consciousness, do not always perfectly reflect what we experience. We can't always put into words everything we're conscious of, period. And this may also help explain why when stimuli are degraded, for example, in a psychophysics lab where you only present stimuli very briefly and the person has to have the metacognition about what it is they saw. So you can't really talk about those things because they're too fast to go by. They go by too fast. Or when they're in peripheral vision, it's hard to give a verbal report because you don't have good access to that. Okay, so if I'm correct that non-conscious and conscious mental models can separately control overt behavior and verbal expression, the effort to scientifically understand consciousness may be even more complicated than we thought, since it would mean that we would not know in a given moment which mental model is in charge of what is being reported. But if we know the problem, we can search for a solution that makes it a feature of consciousness rather than an impediment. So how could we possibly tell the difference? Well, I didn't have any idea at the time, but I gave a lecture at Yale, I think it was in December, and a graduate student wrote to me afterwards and said, I think I have a solution. Joan Onshoko. Here, I'm going to read what she said. One possibility is that the difference between verbal reports controlled by the two mental models lies not just in the superficial words, what people say, but in the relations between these words, how people move from one idea to another. This is a process known as semantic progression. The more implicit, spontaneously constructed verbal reports that arise from a preconscious state may involve more jumping from idea to idea, compared to the more intentionally constructed reports arising from the conscious model. Semantic progression has been measured through existing natural language processing models, latent semantic analysis, or unsupervised embedders that compute the semantic similarity between words or sentences, Words in the same paragraph should show greater similarity than words across different paragraphs. Indeed, these types of analyses have been used to explore the progression of ideas in narrative text and in film, and might be leveraged to distinguish reports based on preconscious or conscious mental states of mind. Okay, I have a whole nother report, but I think I've run out of time. So I'm going to stop sharing and come back to you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Let me switch to um, still not seeing everyone here. Oh. Okay, so thank you very much for the talk, and I think we have about 20 minutes for Q&As, and I would be very grateful if people could introduce themselves in just a few seconds, just to say if you're a philosopher, a biologist, a medical doctor, for example. So please raise your hand. Alok, you're the first one.
Thank you, Thomas. Professor LeDoux, thank you for your work. My question is going to come a little bit from the direction of Stephen Porges's work, Alan Shore's work, and Ian McGilchrist's work. And it feels like one way I would frame it. Okay, so I didn't introduce myself. I am an independent researcher from San Francisco. One of the worlds I inhabit is the world of psychotherapy practitioners, both verbal as well as somatic. And so you would sense that Stephen Porges's work is significant from the somatic practitioners world. And so I'm very grateful for, I guess, the lineage from Gazzaniga and the work you built. You've did this amazing thing of framing the epistemic chasm that James specified between what we expect to be the domain of science, what we're able to practice as the domain of science, and what is the realm of, I guess, our narrative of experience. And then with Romer's work, you built an isthmus, a bridge, and then you took, for 40 years of your work and developed it. So I'm going there with it. What I'm curious, it feels like Ian McGilchrist would have to redo his, last 4 books after your new book. That's my way of introducing my question. Unifying the 2 hemispheres, and then with 70 years of attachment theory and attachment interpersonal biology and affective regulational psychophysiology. So, it's probably the next book you should attempt if you had another lifetime ahead of you, but I just would love to hear your thoughts if you have had any, or you can move to other questions.
No, I can say something about that, because I think what I didn't intentionally start out doing this when I started writing the book. I always start out thinking, okay, I'm going to write a little book. It's only going to be 100 pages max, but it never stops that way. And so you start doing one thing, and I often don't know where I'm going in a book. I start out with just a simple idea, and then it kind of it comes out on its own in a way. There's a quote I have in the book from a literary scholar who said the language, the author doesn't write, language writes. And what he was talking about was like the social context in which we write. So I'm talking. It's not really me that's talking. It's this context of this seminar we're in that's talking. That's my nonverbal mental model talking to you right now, except for the point when I started acknowledging that I was consciously talking to you. So going back to your question, though, this has come up a couple of times in terms of, well, what does this mean for this other set of ideas that's out there? I think it's, no one has to adopt this if they don't want to, but I think it provides a kind of, simplistic breakdown of what the possibilities are in terms of behavioral control. So if we start at the biological realm, there's not a lot of behavior that we control purely biologically, but we have the biological realm is going to be involved in hormones and other things that are going to impact our behavior. So it's going to be having some impact, even if it's not causing the behavior. So the neurobiological realm are all these automatic responses, and the cognitive realm are things where you have mental representations and so forth. And then the conscious is its own thing. So the point is that there's been so much confusion in the field by saying, well, and I did this too, we can use freezing behavior in a rat to understand what's going to make a human feel less fearful or anxious. And I think that's wrong. It's just because if we're freezing in the presence of danger, we feel fear. But that doesn't mean that the fear is causing us to freeze, right? It's it's a measure. And colleagues in the fear conditioning world that I was in so long, I think I've kind of been booted out of it because I say that fear conditioning is not about fear, it's about defense. And so we have to be clear that not all behaviors that occur simultaneously with something are a measure of that actual thing. Freezing doesn't measure the conscious fear. Maybe if we have better understanding of how model-based behavior, goal-directed behaviors work non-consciously, that is closer to the conscious state. But the only measure of the conscious state is the conscious state. You can by talking, or you can do it through metacognition, and but metacognition is not viewed as the answer. It's viewed as something in the same parts of the brain. So I don't know. What I'm saying is that there's a framework here that, let's say you're interested in, I don't talk about affect much. Let's say you're interested in affect. Well, people in affect don't talk about conscious experience much, but conscious experience is not just another kind of thing in affect. It's what our life is about. And so we need to not marginalize it the way it's been marginalized in psychiatry. We have to accept it and understand it. So to do that, we have to somehow measure it, and it's hard to do. Verbal report, not perfect, but it's the best we can get.
You've just unblocked Borges for me. All of trauma therapy has been stuck with safety as the gateway, precisely because of the freezing interpretation. And you just unblocked, because in child therapy, you find that people who are traumatized can still be creative. And I've been presenting that to practitioners. So thank you so much.
So if you're interested in that topic, I wrote a paper with some colleagues called Putting the Mental Back into Mental Disorders in Molecular Psychiatry last year.
So I have a workshop platform for which I might ask you to consider coming and talking to us. But thank you.
Okay. Sorry, that was so long. I used up the whole 20 minutes on it.
Well, that was very useful. I have a kind of naive question about the notion of self. We discussed that a little bit in the past, but some people pretend that there is a self which is not at the conscious level, but this is a biological self. This is an immunological self, for example. Right. So given what you said today, what is your view about that? Maybe you think it's meaningless to ask this question of the self at another level, conscious level, but maybe there is still, something to say about that.
So, as I said at the beginning, it's not that the things that go with the biological self are not important, or the things that go with the conscious self are not important. It's just when we create a little thing in our head that is a self that's different from me, there's nothing else but me in me. It's not like there's another person in there that has volition. So I think we got to take, it's like a homunculus that we put inside us that has power to do things. But it's what has power are these different ways that we can control our behavior, consciously, cognitively, neurobiologically, and so forth. And all of the stuff about self falls within the four realms of existence. I mean, everything in psychology and neuroscience, by definition, is going to fall into those four realms. So it's just a way of packaging and saying, don't conflate what one realm is doing with what another realm is doing, which is so often the case.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions, comments, maybe people disagree on something that Joe said and they want to express themselves with that? Or maybe everybody thought it was so compelling. I don't know.
Well, some people left. They were the ones that disagreed.
Maybe. No, I don't see other questions. Anya.
So I'll raise a question, and I apologize if this is very naive and open-ended, but I'm Anya Plutensky. I'm a philosopher at Washington University in St. Louis. And I'm curious about the relationship between the what you call the sort of unconscious mental model and the conscious mental model. And I realize this is a huge question,
Right.
but I was a little bit mystified about how you got from the left to the right in that, I mean, the right to the left in that model, and how that connection is supposed to work. And maybe you can just recommend more of your work or others' work that can help me.
What do you mean by
understand how
right
that-
to left? You mean from the back of the brain to the front?
So when you had that sort of model that you put up, I
Yeah.
think it was one of your last slides where you had the
Yeah.
sort of the unconscious, and then you had the conscious mental model, and there
Yeah.
was this language of thought, mentalese translation function that was going on between them. And I guess
Right.
I'd just like to know more about how that works on your view.
Yeah, I mean, there's, can I put up a slide? So the
Yeah,
part, oh, I think I got it. This, hang on. All right, sorry, it's not screen share. Okay, here we go. Ah, okay, I'm pushing the wrong button. Here we go. All right. So, all right, there's a lot of what I riff off of is Endel Tolving's three kinds of consciousness: autonoetic, self-awareness; noetic, semantic conceptual awareness; and anoetic. It's a little bit confusing as to what anoetic is. And I bugged him a bunch of times about it, and he said, "Well, I don't know. It's the one I'm least interested in." But I pursued it quite a bit, and so the basic idea is that you have focal consciousness, which would be semantic and self-consciousness. And then you have this fringe consciousness, which is William James' fringe of consciousness, where you have some things that are on the border between conscious and unconscious. And that's where this anoetic consciousness, I think, lives. It's at the fringe, right at the border. And that's, it's always confusing to talk about these fringe consciousness because it's associated with procedural memory. Noetic consciousness is associated with semantic memory, and self-consciousness with episodic memory. So how if the fringe consciousness is procedural, how can it be consciousness? Because procedural memory is unconscious. So, but it's, again, we're taking ideas and giving them too much power. the doesn't, everything that's unconscious is not unconscious to the same degree. So that's what the fringe is, the stuff that's kind of conscious and not conscious. And I think that is where this anoetic thing where you don't have to acknowledge it, it's just there. All right, I just wanted to get that out of the way. So what happened to? I guess I don't have that slide up. So in the slide, it would show how all of these things come together. Let's just talk briefly about it. The first mental model is getting all the inputs and integrating it and generating the outputs. The subjective experience becomes the conscious mental model, and that feeds back to the non-conscious mental model. That allows you to be aware. It allows you what you are aware of to re-enter the loop from the top. So the output of the non-conscious mental model goes to subjective experience, and that goes back to the non-conscious mental model, allowing you to then consciously experience what you were subjectively aware of. And the reason I went down this road eventually was because in David Rosenthal's higher order theory, you have this infinite regress problem. It's like you're not conscious of the initial, you're not conscious of the higher order state. Your higher order state allows you to be conscious of the lower order state. So how do you become conscious of the higher order state? Well, you then have another higher order state. But then how do you become conscious of that? You have another high. But David didn't like that, and no one would like that. It's just infinite regress. But with the loop back from the conscious state to the first mental model, it allows the conscious experience to enter into the loop. I don't know if that makes any sense at all. And then there's a shameful advertisement for this documentary about my life, work, and music. Mike Zanaga, Eric Kendall, Liz Phelps, Daniela Schiller, Roseanne Cash, famous musicians in there and so forth, on Amazon. I don't know if it's on Amazon France, but anyway, let me turn this off. Stop sharing. All right. Anything else? I'm sorry, I probably didn't answer your question, but I can send you a figure, or you can buy the book and see.
Joe, I think there's a question in the chat. Can you access to the chat, or do you want?
Yeah, no, I can go. Oh, that's not for me.
Well, I think it's you said in response to Alok. I guess the question is for you, right? I don't know. It maybe the
no, he said that about.
Yeah, I'm the one who's made that statement.
Oh yeah, you did. Okay. Sorry. Okay, I misread. Okay.
But
so you can answer.
This is well, child psychologists who use the interactional attachment model find that they can organize the room with drawing materials and toys, and a child who is still technically frozen is able to engage and do interesting things and soften their frozen state. And the dogma in trauma therapy is unless you unfreeze the traumatized person, they can't access right brain flexible creativity. And Professor LeDoux explicitly articulated both in his talk and then in response to my question that freezing of the peripheral nervous system should not be extended to the additional layers. And this is where his constructions in the first part of his talk, where there is interactive, like in the Russian doll model, that these are not separable layers, they are interactive both upwards and downwards, allows you to have a different ontology of interactions. And then he more specifically and clearly described that the so-called consciousness functions can be operating in Okay, I'm not doing as good a job as Professor LeDoux did, but
No, I'd like you to come to all my talks so you can explain what I'm saying.
oh, I will if you come to some of my invitations to the actual practitioners. But I mean, to the audience person, the fact is that child psychologists don't worry about going through the gateway of unfreezing the body, and they start working with the kids, and the kids are able to do higher order consciousness functions, and somehow therapy happens within 6 months, and they just are transformed, and it does not follow the dogma of trauma based reasoning. And Professor LeDoux has just organized both the epistemology, ontology, and the scientific data for, in my opinion, why that is the observed fact. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any other question? We still have a few minutes, but I also know that. Okay, so I don't see any other questions. So really, Joe, I wanted to thank you for this very, very deep and very interesting talk. So let me try and upload again. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you back.
Thank you so much. That was great. And thank you everyone for your presence and your questions. So thank you so much all. And Joe, thank you again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Been fun.
Take care.